I'm interested in public spaces. I grew up in rural North Wales in a house in the middle of nowhere. There was only one bus every couple of hours, and the idea of lingering in a public space, like a park or town square, felt like a very alien concept. Travelling to London as a child offered me a glimpse of another world, one I wanted to inhabit. Public transport was fast, reliable, and frequent, and public spaces like parks, stations, squares, shopping centres, and so on were busy, well used, and full of interesting, diverse people. So it's with this background, accompanied by the current moment that we live in, on an uncertain threshold of pandemic to hopefully post-pandemic future, that my current research question has been written. Post-pandemic, how can current and former public transit spaces make use of placemaking to revitalise and encourage reuptake of the network, and to help build community and localism in the areas they are situated? So let me talk a bit more about what this means. Firstly, current and former transit spaces. Current transit spaces are things like stations, active railway lines, bus hubs, working tram infrastructure, and so on. By former transit spaces, I mean things like abandoned railway lines, buildings, and other associated infrastructure which has fallen into disuse. Then the word placemaking. One definition of placemaking is that in the same way that homemaking is the process of turning a house into a home, placemaking is the process of turning a space into a place. It's all about transforming previously unoptimized spaces into attractive destinations. So what does this look like in the context of transit infrastructure? Well, in still active spaces, this could be everything from putting a piano on a train concourse, to creating desirable shopping and eating areas in and around stations, to making use of railway arches for business and social enterprises. In the context of disused infrastructure, this could be things like New York's High Line Park, or the hopefully soon-to-come Camden High Line. It could also mean redeveloping former station buildings into positive public spaces for the communities they exist in, for example the Roundhouse venue in North London. There are many more examples in both cases. I am specifically interested in how such placemaking can be used to revitalise communities in the wake of the pandemic, and also to help encourage and welcome people back onto public transit, which is an essential part of our fight against global warming. I use the terms community and localism. Community can obviously be quite a broad term, but generally here I'm referring to any scenario in which people are enabled or encouraged to interact positively, form connections and ongoing social bonds, especially in this instance based on their location, living in the same or nearby neighbourhoods. Localism is another concept which I've been interested in during my research. The idea of our changing habits in the wake of the pandemic, a shift towards shopping, working, socialising, and generally operating our lives from within a radius much closer to our homes than we might formerly have done. My question considers this new era of potential localism and community, and how it can interact with the still essential public transit infrastructure which crisscrosses our communities. So my practice-based research so far. I created a short book documenting side by side my life in October 2019 and October 2020. The book collates my movements, activities, photography, daily visual diaries and retrospective notes, allowing me to compare side by side the dramatic shifts in behaviour, ideas and experiences around public space that happened over that year to me personally. I also conducted an in-depth review of both my photography archive and visual diary archive from the last 2 years, and pulled out all interesting sources and ideas in relation to public space. As my research moved to focus on transit infrastructure, I created this detailed document of a place close to my heart, Brighton Railway Station. Using a combination of photography, Google Maps and memory, I created this 3D drawing of the station, and used it to highlight as many examples of placemaking as I could, to highlight what potential filled spaces stations can be. I then focused in on my local area now, neighbourhood of Battersea Park, which is crisscrossed by train lines between Waterloo, Victoria, Clapham Junction, the largest interchange station in the UK, and many other smaller stations. I decided to do a practical exercise in mapping, documenting and writing by following a section of railway near my house, from Battersea Park Station up to Victoria Station. I documented all non-rail related interactions with railway infrastructure in communities along the route, both realised and potential. I used my photography and notes from the expedition to create this riso-printed fold-out map of the route, some conceptual photo montages, and a detailed blog documenting my journey. In terms of other research, my reading has ranged far and wide. Some key texts which I've appreciated or wish to read further are the Routledge Handbook of Placemaking, The Great Good Place by Ray Oldenburg, Edward Soja's 6 Discourses on the Post-Metropolis, Mark Ogay's writings on non-places, including Introduction to the Anthropology of Supermodernity, Michel de Certeau's Walking the City from the Practice of Everyday Life, and Lauren Elkin's Flanneuse. To skim through many other areas of research, I've been reading about public-private partnerships, the idea of the commons, Many writings on New York's Hudson Yards development, particularly the iconic Thomas Heatherwick Beehive Suicide Tower, No Place to Go, a book on public toilet provision, the Camden High Line development, the Seoul High Line, the history of placemaking through interior design choices in metro stations, both in London, LA, Russia, and more, Japanese underground metro malls, urban planning and walkability in modern UK garden cities, urban planning and walkability or lack of in the US and associated food deserts and car reliance, Michel Foucault's Heterotopias, Gordon Matta Clark's Food Project, the Narrative Environments MA at Central St Martin's, looking at architecture studios like Archigram and Superstudio, the history of TfL's poster design, and more. So I find myself at a key stage of the project. I'm confident in my passion for the subject, the methodologies I've used so far to research it, and the richness of this area of research, but I need to figure out what I'm going to do next, and how I'm going to do it. I had a rewarding tutorial with Tony last week where he referred me to a former MA student, Kat Drew's final project, who was looking at gentrification, specifically focusing on the neighbourhood of Dalston. Her approach particularly appealed to me for a number of reasons. One, it was participatory. She worked with members of the local community to develop her ideas. Two, it was print-based and low-cost. She worked with Riso to create leaflets and flyers which she could easily share with her community, as well as a beautiful final outcome. Three, it was documentary. She focused on looking around her, having conversations, looking at archives and histories of the area. While I would of course not look to follow exactly her approach, and indeed that would be impossible in the current moment, I'm keen to consider in more detail how my community lives with, around, through and alongside the huge amount of railway infrastructure in the area. How are the spaces created by this infrastructure being used? How have they been used and how might they be used in future to best serve the communities around them and the transit network which they support? And how can I, as a designer, document, advocate for and uplift these ideas?